Hello everyone, and welcome back to another 5-minute study through the book of Acts. We're on Acts chapter 7 today. Let's talk about this. If you want the handout that you're about to see, there's a link down in the description. You can download it for free and a lot of other resources on our website. So when did the events of Acts chapter 7 happen? Well, to understand these events, you really have to read the end of Acts chapter 6. It ties in directly. And if you don't read it, you might be lost if you just try to pick up in chapter 7. Acts 7 is all about the defense that Stephen gives when he's on trial for blasphemy, but he actually gets arrested back in chapter 6. That's why it's important. We don't have exact dates as far as the year of when the events of Acts chapter 7 happened, but probably between 33 and 35 AD. In terms of our characters in this chapter, we really only have two. Stephen, he was a man that was full of the Holy Spirit, full of faith. He was one of the 7 men that was selected to care for the Hellenist widows back at the beginning of chapter 6. And as we mentioned, he's arrested at the end of chapter 6, and now he's on trial. And then we have the people who are overseeing his trial, the high priest and the Jewish council. These were men that hated Jesus, they hated Jesus' message, and they hated Jesus' servants. Where did the events of Acts chapter 7 happen? Well, they all happened in and around the city of Jerusalem. This is a big chapter, but I've got it broken down into only 2 sections. The first section, verses 1 through 53, is Stephen's response to his accusers. This is the defense that he's making for the crimes that he's been accused of. In the very first verse, the high priest asks him if he wants to make a defense, and Stephen kind of launches into his defense beginning in verse 2. He began by recounting the history of the Jewish nation, beginning all the way back at the father of the nation, Abraham. Abraham left his homeland in the land of the Chaldeans to go to a new land that he had never seen, but God promised him. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob, and Jacob was the father of the 12 patriarchs, or the 12 tribes of Israel. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for hundreds of years, and they grew into a really large nation. Eventually, God sent 10 plagues on the Egyptians. In their final escape from Egypt, God led them through the Red Sea and destroyed the Egyptian army. And then God led them through the wilderness for 40 years to the Promised Land. Moses foretold the people that God was going to send a prophet who was similar to himself. And when that prophet arrived, the people were supposed to listen to him. But the Israelites turned their hearts away from God, and they refused to listen. For years and years and years, this problem existed. And the Jews had really been a rebellious people since that time. Back when the Israelites were still wandering around in the wilderness, God had instructed Moses to build a tent, a tabernacle. This tabernacle was later replaced by a more permanent structure by King Solomon, and that permanent structure was the temple. Stephen said that the temple had served its purpose, but it was only ever meant to be a symbolic dwelling place for God. God, as great as he is, doesn't dwell in temples made with men's hands. They could never construct something great enough to contain him. And Stephen said this because he had been accused of speaking blasphemous words against the temple. Stephen knew that God never intended for the temple to be a permanent fixture in the Lord's worship. Stephen then really goes after the council very boldly, very sternly, and he accuses them of being stiff-necked and being rebels against God, just like their ancestors had been. Their actions validated Stephen's accusation, because just like their fathers had killed God's prophets, the members of that council had just murdered Jesus, who was the one who all the prophets had prophesied and foretold. And that finally leads us to our last and sad section of this chapter, verses 54 through 60. Stephen is killed for his faith. The council members were enraged by Stephen's words. But Stephen, in that moment, was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he said that he saw heaven opened and he saw the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. The council ran at Stephen, they dragged him out of the city, and they murdered him with stones. But just before dying, Stephen prayed to God, and he asked them not to hold those council members accountable for what they were doing. And interestingly, in Acts chapter 7, verse 58, Luke records that Saul, who we know as Paul, later the Apostle Paul, was there as Stephen was being murdered, and he consented to the actions of the council. This has been a long chapter, so I've got just one application for you, and that is that the truth stirs up anger and offense and outrage in the hearts of people who hate hearing it. I think that's especially important for Christians to remember in our day and age. Just because somebody is angry with you, just because someone is outraged by your words, just because somebody is quote, offended by your arguments doesn't necessarily mean that you've said or done anything wrong.